प्रेम सेवा शरणु प्रेम
Like any museum, there's like a million different ways that you can spend your time enjoying the Mahabharata. And I do want to encourage all of you to go and find your own path through the epic. But before you scatter just yet, I thought it would be nice to think about sort of three important ways in which we can, as a group, evaluate the epic as a whole. One way is to analyze the epic in terms of cosmic cyclical time. The second is to look at how the whole epic is framed with a double frame. And the third way is to think of key themes, recurring themes that we're going to see being developed in the story. So let's take a look. One way in which we can conceptualize the whole epic is to see it in terms of how it fits into this Hindu model of cyclical cosmic time, that yuga theory we talked about. Now, I should note that the yuga theory is a late development, that scholars have sort of argued that the yugas were introduced into the Mahabharata only at the very end of its compositional history. But still, it's there so that the epic's readers, and so like us, could make sense of the plot. So what we can see is that the first book of the epic concerns events that take place before and also during the Dwapara age, that kind of relatively golden age of Dharma that's immediately before our really terrible age of the Kali Yuga. The elder stories are all set in the Dwapara age, and also the Pandavas and Kauravas' birth and marriages. Books 2 through 5 are also entirely within this Dwapara age. The dice match where the Pandavas lose the kingdom, there's their exile, when they hide in Virata, their negotiations with peace, all of that stuff. The next books 6 through 10, are all about the war, right? They're the most graphically bloody books of the whole epic. There's lots of blood and guts and violence of every kind, satisfying all of your violent, desires, ending with a particularly horrible attack in the middle of the night that decimates the Pandava camp after the battle has already been lost by the Kauravas. This is book 10 of the epic, which we're going to actually read in its entirety, I hope. The story keeps going, though, actually. It's only half over at this point. Books 11 through 15 are very, very long books in which the Pandavas, now that they're crowned kings, start to rebuild this broken world. They do all kinds of Vedic rituals, including a horse sacrifice. They reconcile with Dhritarashtra, the blind king, and the queen Gandhari, whose sons they've killed. They listen to Bhishma's teachings on politics, on morality, on liberation. They cremate the dead on both sides of the war. Book 16 then tells about the disaster that awaits Krishna and his entire clan after the war, and ultimately the sad death of God alone in the woods. It's that moment of Krishna's death, according to tradition, that's when the Dwapara Yuga comes to an end and our Kali age begins. In the last two books, 17 and 18, the Pandavas entrust their throne to their grandson, Parikshit, and then they head up to the Himalayas, traveling on foot to get up to heaven. That's when the epic comes to a close, when they are in heaven. Another way to look at the epic, besides this narrative structure, the yuga and narrative structure, is to think about frame structure. The core story is about the Kauravas and the Pandavas and their massive war. It's placed within two other outer frames. It's basically a story within a story within a story. The first frame starts with that king named Parikshit. That's the grandson of the Pandavas, who's the ruler of the Kuru state. He gets killed by a snake bite. Then his son wants to get revenge on the snakes, right? And so he decides to perform a sacrifice in order to genocidally destroy all of the snakes in the world. As the ritual progresses, it starts to happen. Snakes start sort of flying into the fire from all over the place. Then, to put a stop to this genocide, the sage Vyasa comes and interrupts the ritual. He tells Janamejaya, hey, look, you ought to first consider about this problem of retributional violence and the harm that vengeance had actually caused to your own family. So Vyasa tells Janamejaya, look, I just happen to have composed an epic about your family called the Mahabharata. about the violent war that they endured. He then tells his loyal student who's sitting next to him, Vaishampayana, to recite this epic to the king Janamejaya. So that's the first frame of the story around the core of the battle. The second frame story around that is that a Brahmin bard by the name of Ugrashravas happened to be sitting at Janamejaya's sacrifice. He's a smart Vedic Brahmin, so as the epic's being told, he manages to memorize all 108,000 verses as they're being recited by Vaishampayana. He then goes out in the forest where he meets a group of Brahmins who's led by a fellow named Shonaka, who happen to be conducting a 12-year kind of Vedic ritual conference with hundreds of priests involved out in the woods. Ugrashravas comes to this conference and he says, hey, look, I've got some good news. I've heard this really amazing new thing called the epic Mahabharata, and that you all should listen up. He tells them the story that Vaishampayana had told to Janamejaya that Vyasa had composed. So, are you following along with all this? There's that outermost frame of a Vedic Brahmin bard telling the epic to a Vedic Brahmin audience. There's an inner frame of a non-Vedic Brahmin bard telling the epic to a Kshatriya king. Inside of it all, there's a core epic itself, that internal story of Kshatriyas on Kshatriyas, and how they came to fight in a massive, fateful battle. So what does the double frame do? It's only there at the beginning and at the very end, so maybe it doesn't do a whole lot in terms of the plot itself, but it's there, and what it does, I think, is to give you three different interpretive perspectives that are at play in the epic, right? At its very core, what you have is an old Kshatriya martial epic. It's a story about warrior culture, about brothers killing brothers, and about how fate brought to an end an entire race of warriors, basically. Around that story, you have an interpretive lens where Brahmins are giving royal Kshatriyas and other people in power some kind of good moral lessons about behavior and governance. How do you rule ethically? How do you rule peacefully? How do you rule successfully? This is all part of that second frame. Outside of it all, there's a kind of brainiac conversation maybe between Brahmins and other Brahmins. These are all the kind of very pedantic ideas and themes that in the epic that concern things like Vedic ritual, about Brahmin identity, about the right way to renounce or disengage from the world. And it's at this level, it's a philosophical, spiritual text. In other levels, it's a moral and political text in that middle frame. Or at the ground zero of the epic, it's a gripping war story. Right? It's a really good war story. Within these frames, we can talk about a large number of themes that the epic takes up for consideration. Now, one thing they say is that whatever exists is found in the Mahabharata, and if it's not found in the Mahabharata, then it doesn't exist. So pretty much any theme or idea you're interested in, you're looking for, you can probably find it somewhere within this Mahabharata museum. One of the key themes that does flow through the epic is that of kind of apocalypse, a sort of pessimistic view about fate. The Mahabharata is a story of how everything that can go wrong does go wrong. It's kind of like an ancient Murphy's Law. It's about the end of the golden age, about how moral order and ethical behavior, standards of decency all break down in a perfectly decent country like the Kuru state. And how all of it just sort of seems unavoidable, like there's nothing we can do about it. It's just destiny. It's the cruel ravages of time, basically. Another important theme in the Mahabharata is about moral or ethically conscious politics. It might be, in fact, the central concern of the epic. How do you govern a kingdom in a peaceful and just way while still maintaining a firm grip over power? Right? How do you stop your enemies? How do you punish the wicked without kind of falling into a vortex of vengeance and retribution? This is the biggest of the kind of moral issues, or the dilemmas of the epic, the kind of conflict between ethical behavior, being good, and power, between dharma and artha. And it's maybe up to us to see if we can find an answer. There's also something going on with gender in this epic that I should mention. The women of the epic, maybe for the first time that we've seen, kind of talk back. to the men, right? They're feisty, they have desires, dreams, emotions, virtues, and flaws. They often feel independent, right? They feel like they're independent. They think for themselves, they speak their mind. Draupadi is the prime example of this. It's refreshing to see, I think, for sure. But we can also kind of ask a few deeper questions about this. We should keep in mind that the composers of the epic were still all men, right? The Sanskrit composers. So what are they saying if they have self-assured and forthright women characters in their epic, right? Are they saying that actual women in the world should be acting like Draupadi or Kunti? Or are they actually doing the opposite? Are they cautioning the patriarchy around them that you shouldn't allow women to behave like Draupadi or Kunti? You shouldn't make it so that women can cause trouble, that kind of thing. I'd say you could probably argue both ways about this gender puzzle, and again, that's one of the things that makes it interesting, right? And you can take up this question in the future. Another overarching idea that the epic develops for its audiences concerns kind of an applied vision of an idea that you can call social dharma. This is an idea that's it's a response to maybe that basic question we've been talking about violence and suffering in the world. What are you supposed to do when you encounter violence, suffering, conflict, pain in this world? When you have to make really difficult decisions, choices about it. The epic gives you lots of different options. Maybe one of the recurring ideas that the epic latches onto is that you shouldn't renounce the world no matter what. You shouldn't retreat from it when that problem of violence, suffering, conflict, pain arises. Instead, you ought to try to solve this problem through morally grounded action by acting in accordance with dharma. Now, what does that mean exactly? Well, for one, we may not really like the Mahabharata's answer, but the epic does strongly support a normative, conservative, Brahmin-centered vision that every person has their own personalized set of rules and privileges that are based on your caste, on your varna, your stage of life, your ashrama. And you have to respect those normative rules, basically, and also respect those who are higher up than you in the social ladder. So it's a socially conservative text, ultimately. Another key philosophical concept that the epic develops, and this is within the Gita in particular, is the idea of karma yoga. That it's possible to stay in the world and still enable your soul to escape the bondage of karma and rebirth. This means basically that if you're interested in moksha, you don't have to renounce worldly life. You can keep your day job and renounce on the inside while you're still working. It's a way to solve that kind of ritualist versus renouncer debate in some ways. Now, finally, the Mahabharata explores a grand theory of devotional theology throughout its text, this idea of bhakti, which says that if it's too hard to do all of these things, to govern justly, to liberate yourself on the inside while still doing your day job, then there's a simpler way to do all of this, which is to trust God, right? To dedicate your life to God. You have to recognize first the existence of God, hidden as he or she is within our world. You have to learn how to be friends with God and to listen what he or she tells you. Right? So there you have it, a number of key themes and ideas that we can maybe look for as we're trying to make sense of all the incredible exhibits and spectacles that we're going to see once we go inside the Mahabharata Museum. So get your books out, crack them open, start reading book 1 of the epic, and I'll meet you all the way over there at the exit after you go past the gift shop, and I'll see you then.